Everyone's trying to pick a winner. That's not how you make money in March. The real question is who is priced wrong? So, what we did was take the market odds and compare them to 10,000 simulations built on power ratings, statistics, and fundamental factors that we think decide games in March. And what we found is where the sports book is off. Because in this tournament, you don't need the winner, you need the value. So before we get into it, drop your winner in the comments. I want to see where everyone's at before we break this video down. All right, so before we get into the analysis, this is the most important slide in the entire video. These are the current future odds for the teams that we're about to break down, and more importantly, what the market is actually saying about each of these teams' chances to win the tournament. So when you see Duke at plus 300, that's not just a number. That's the market telling you they believe Duke wins this tournament about 25% of the time. And everything we do from this point forward is going to be measured against that. So, not our opinions, not narratives, not what we think should happen. We're asking one question the entire time. Is the market right or is it wrong? Because if the market is right, there's going to be no bet. But if the market is even off slightly, that's where value starts to creep in. So as we go through each team, talent, matchups, coaching, physicality, you should constantly be thinking, do I agree with this price or do I not agree with this price? Because that's how real bettors approach futures markets, not by picking winners, but pricing probabilities. Okay, now this is the actual seating landscape. This is how the bracket is currently structured. Who's on the one lines, who's on the twos, threes, and where everyone sits across the regions. And this matters because in March, path is everything. It's not just how good you are, it's who you have to go through. So as we break these teams down, keep this in mind. Not just how good is this team, but what path are they actually facing to get to the championship. Okay, so here is the numbers board. This is where the profiles actually show up in the data. So these rankings are how these teams compare against each other across areas that matter the most. We're talking efficiency, shooting, turnovers, free throw pressure, and even rebounding. And you can already start to see the separation from some of the teams here. Let's go with Michigan and Duke. They're sitting at the very top. They're top two in power rating, top two in net rating, and then top two in shooting efficiency. So that's what a complete team looks like. They don't rely on one thing, they check multiple boxes. Now let's look at Houston, right? Number one in turnover differential, but they're the most disciplined team here, as you can see. They take care of the ball and then they force mistakes, but at the same time, they're last in rebounding. So the question starts to become, does that discipline hold up or does the lack of physicality get exposed? Exposed. Let's move to Iowa State. They show a similar split, top tier in forcing turnovers, but near the bottom in rebounding, and that's a high variance profile. They can create chaos, but they can also get controlled inside. Then you have teams like Michigan State, second in rebounding, one of the most physical teams here, but bottom tier in terms of shooting and turnover control. So they win with the toughness, not just, that efficiency. And this is really what the board tells you. Every team, right, they have their strengths, but every team also has something that you can attack. And that's going to be crucial going forward. So now the goal isn't just to look at who's ranked higher, it's to figure out which strengths translate and which weaknesses will get exposed as the tournament goes on. Okay, so now let's jump to the fundamentals. This is how I break down every team in this field. Four things decide who actually survives in March. It's talent, matchups, coaching, and physicality. And these are ranked against each other. So lower is better. Obviously, the number one team in each of these is going to be the best. Number two, the second best, so on and so forth. Let's start with Duke. They grade out number one in terms of talent. And that comes from having a true go-to player in Boozer, and then also efficient guard play all around. They also rank second in matchups, meaning that there's no clear weakness that you can consistently attack. So when a game gets tight, they don't need a specific script to win. They can win in multiple ways. Moving on to Michigan, Michigan is a completely different build. They rank number one in matchups and top two in physicality, and that's going to tell you exactly how they win. They control the paint, they defend at a high level, and then they force you into uncomfortable shots. But they're not necessarily relying on elite shot creation to bail them out. So if a team turns into a possession by possession grind, they'll be good. If it turns into a shootout, that's where things will start to get tighter. Now let's move on to Houston. They're one of the cleanest profiles here. Top 5 talent in matchups, coaching, also talent. Sorry about that. I skimmed through that. And then they're also elite in terms of discipline. They don't turn the ball over, they don't beat themselves, but they're near the bottom in terms of physicality. So they can control a game because of the guard play, but they can't always impose themselves physically. And in this tournament, that usually matters down the stretch. Next is going to be a team like Iowa State. They're on the opposite side of the spectrum here. They rank top 3 in talent and matchups, so they can all be, absolutely compete with basically anyone on the board that you see here. But they're last in physicality. They don't protect the paint. They don't dominate the glass, so their games rely more on the guards, the shooting, and then creating that high pace chaos. It's basically they're a high ceiling team, but it's also high risk, so their floor is not necessarily that high. When we move on to a team like Florida, they're probably the most one dimensional team on this board. They rank number 1 in physicality, so they dominate the glass, they create those extra possessions, but they're near the bottom in terms of talent, matchups, and coaching. So if they don't control the game physically, they don't have a second way to win and they will get exposed. Next, Michigan State. They're a classic tournament profile, number 1 in coaching, and that's real experience in this setting, right? Strong in physicality. They rebound, they compete, they stay in games, but they're middle to low in terms of talent and matchups. So they're not controlling games, they're basically surviving them. And this is the entire point of this board, ladies and gentlemen. There is no perfect team here. The teams at the top have multiple ways to win, the teams in the middle need the game to go a certain way, and then the teams at the bottom have one clear strength and then one clear weakness. And in March, you don't lose because you're bad. You lose because the bracket forces you into those weaknesses. So if you like this Ball Street style, just straight numbers, no narratives, hit that like button so we know to keep building on this series. Okay, so before we get into the deeper breakdown, this is going to be the baseline. These are basically the power ratings pulled from multiple credible sources. We're talking about KenPom, ESPN BPI, D ratings, and teamrankings.com, all of these guys. And instead of relying on just one model, I averaged them out to remove the bias and get a cleaner market view on the far right. So here's what matters. Duke is the clear number 1 across the board. There's no debate here, right? Every model, every power rating, they all agree that Duke is the team. Then we'll move down to teams like Michigan and Arizona. They sit right behind them, consistently top 3 no matter where you look, but that's it. Top 3. Then there's a drop. We have Florida, Houston, Iowa State. These teams are good, but not necessarily elite when you look at the numbers. And then after that, you're getting into the flawed teams based on the ratings. Remember, just based on ratings now. Illinois, Purdue, UConn, Michigan State, Gonzaga. So this gives us the market baseline, right? As you see this is how good teams are on paper. You have to remember that on paper. But here's the problem. March is not played on paper. And that's why the next step is going to be figuring out who actually wins the games in these environments. Now, this is going to be our simulation board. These results came from 10,000 simulations that we ran with the bracket using everything that you've seen from the previous slides. So, power ratings, statistical profiles, talent, matchups, coaching, everything. And what you're looking at here is the most common path that came out of those simulations. We're going to start with the Elite Eight. And out east, Duke over UConn is what our simulation had. That matchup was very close. Duke won about 52.6% of the time on a neutral floor. Basically, around Duke -1 was the average margin of victory in this. The reason was pretty simple. Duke was just a little bit more complete, right? UConn has the championship profile. I will say that. They do have the championship profile, but Duke had fewer stress points overall. Now, if we move to the south, we have Houston over Florida. This one came out about 58.9% of the time in favor of Houston, with an average margin of victory of about 2.5 points. And that was discipline versus physicality. At least in our eyes, it is. Florida's edge was rebounding and second chance points, but Houston's structure, turnover control, and then their coaching as well, it was just too much for Florida. So over a large sample size, it did show up Houston more often than not when they played Florida. Now, let's go out west. Arizona over Gonzaga. That was one of the title ones. Arizona only won this 51.9% of the time, and the average margin of victory was only a half of a point. So this was almost dead even when you're talking about Arizona versus Gonzaga. Arizona just came out slightly ahead because they were a little bit more complete physically and then also defensively. While Gonzaga, they kept a cleaner offensive profile, but it looked like it just wasn't enough out of all the matchup simulations that we ran. In the Midwest, Michigan was over Iowa State. Excuse me. This was one of the stronger results on the board, or maybe more the dominant matchups here in terms of Michigan. They won 63.7% of the time out of this, with the higher average margin of victory of 4.5. So that was a direct style clash, I believe, from just looking at it. Michigan's interior defense, their physicality, that consistently exposed Iowa State's biggest weakness, which is protecting the paint and controlling the glass. So moving on to some of the Week 16 results, and this is because some of them, the teams that we are measuring here, didn't make it into the Elite Eight or into the finals. So we're going to touch on this just a little bit. Uh, in the Sweet 16, it kept showing up in some of the ways or in the simulations. UConn over Michigan State. So UConn won about 57.8% of the time. Average margin of victory about -2. That came down to UConn being the cleaner offensive team. Even though Michigan State brought the better rebounding in the classic March toughness, it still just wasn't enough. Houston over Illinois was another one. That was one of the most decisive matchups here. Houston almost won 72% of the time, and their margin of victory was 7 points over Illinois. Illinois can score, but I think that's just about it because Houston's discipline, defense, and coaching made Illinois just play too uncomfortable too often. I think that's all Illinois has is offense, no defense at all. Gonzaga over Purdue was the next one. Gonzaga, they won about 54% of those matchups. Average margin of victory was about 1 point. Very close matchup, but Purdue's interior defense weakness was the biggest flaw between the two teams, and it showed up enough for Gonzaga to come out ahead more often than not. So let's move on to that Final Four. Final Four, of course, we ran Duke against Houston. Duke won that matchup about 55% of the time. Roughly, I would say Duke -2 was the average margin of victory. Houston could absolutely drag Duke into a half court fight, but Duke had more offensive answers and more ways to win in my eyes. On the other side, we had Michigan against Arizona. Michigan won that 58.8% of the time. Average margin of victory about 2.5 points. That was Michigan's structure, defense, and interior control wearing down Arizona. Uh, I just didn't see them having the reliability across all four buckets in terms of Arizona being more, I would say, well equipped, like overall in terms of a team, just well balanced for Michigan. They just weren't enough. Moving on to the championship, in the final we had Duke over Michigan. That was the championship matchup that came up most often. Duke wins this 57% of the time, roughly about a 2.5 point margin of victory. So that's really the whole tournament in one game. Michigan can control and contain, but Duke could still function when things got taken away. And over a big sample, that gave Duke the edge, right? Again, this is not saying that's exactly what will happen. This is just saying that when we ran the tournament 10,000 times using a simulation, uh, this was the path that showed up the most. Okay, now this is the most important slide in the entire report. This is where we actually find value. So let me define this clearly for you guys. Market rank, that's coming directly from the odds that we showed you in the first slide, right? That's how the sportsbook are pricing each team. Now, the analysis rank is just going to be from our 10,000 simulations. That's going to be how often each team actually won the tournament based on everything that we built, right? We've already touched on it, everything combined, power rating, stats, matchups, everything. So now we're comparing perception versus reality. Let's go to the top of the board. We're looking at Duke and Michigan. There's no edge here. They're priced exactly where they should be. That's where their holds, right? Exactly where they should be. They should win the championship. They should be in the finals. They should be competing. There's no real value for these teams. Let's now look at the overvalued teams and get them out of the way. Looking at Arizona, the market has them at 3. We had them at 6. That's a 3 spot gap. That's being overvalued. Florida, even worse, right? Market has them at 4. We had them all the way at 8th. They just could not win these tournaments when we did the simulation. And that showed up across all the simulations. They relied too heavily on that physicality with no secondary way of winning. Iowa State and Illinois, same story here. They don't hold up consistently across all simulations. They have too many weaknesses for the tournament, and that's going to catch up to them. Now, let's start getting to those undervalued teams. This is where you want to start sprinkling your cash. Now, let's go to Houston. Market had them at 5. We had them at 3. It's not massive, I know, but it's real value. That discipline profile travels in March, especially what they have. Now, remember, being ranked 3 to us means that they won the tournament the third most. So they have the third most volume in terms of winning the tournament when we run the simulation. Let's go to the next team. Market has UConn at number 8. We had them at 4. That's a 4 spot difference. That's massive value. Coach, structure, tournament experience. They show up over and over and over again in these simulations. Gonzaga is another one. Market has them at 11. We have them at 7. Again, undervalued, efficient offense, clean execution, and they outperform the price. I will say, if you don't think they have a chance at winning it all, though, you have to throw them away. Even though we have 4 spots of them outperforming the market, the real question is, can they win the tournament? So if you think that they cannot, it's a no bet. Now, the biggest one here is going to be Michigan State. Market has them at 10. We have them at 5. That's the best value on the board here, ladies and gentlemen. Number 1 in coaching, strong physical profile, and they consistently outperformed in our simulations. So this is the takeaway here. If the market is right, you don't bet. If the market is wrong, that's where the edge is. And based on everything that we built, your value teams, they're basically Houston, UConn, Gonzaga, and Michigan State. Your fades are going to be Arizona, Florida, Iowa State, and Illinois. And then everything else is priced exactly where it should be. So if you're into this type of unbiased breakdown, make sure you're subscribed. This is what we do here. And that's the full breakdown. No bias, no narratives, just numbers, matchups, and where the value actually is. If you like the Ball Street style, just straight analysis, hit that like button so I keep building these. And if you want more unbiased sports betting handicapping, make sure you're subscribed and comment your winner of the tournament. I want to see who you're rolling with. And if these breakdowns give you an edge this March and you want to support this channel in any way possible, we have super thanks down at the bottom. They're always appreciated. We're not asking for it, but hey, if you want to slap us a coffee, good on you, and we'll love you for it. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.